Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be exploring how Colombian society remembers the Pablo Escobar era and all the violence that came with the drug trade in the 80s and 90s. You sent over this fascinating academic thesis that examines this through media representations of Escobar and some of the other big players.
Yeah, that's right. And we'll be looking at more than just the facts. We're going to kind of unpack how those facts are presented, how they're debated, and how they end up contributing to the collective memory of
Mm.
this really intense period in Colombia's history. I think it's really interesting how memory can be kind of manipulated, especially when we're talking about events that cause so much trauma.
It really is like a puzzle, isn't it? Trying to put together the truth when some pieces are missing, others seem like they're hidden, and everybody has a different picture in their head depending on their point of view.
Absolutely. And so to really understand this, we need to start in Medellin, the heart of the cocaine trade back in the 1970s.
Mm.
Before cocaine even became like this huge thing, Medellin was already a city that was divided by this extreme economic inequality and social segregation.
The thesis really paints a picture of a city where the elite held all the power, while the lower classes were kind of stuck on the fringes, facing limited opportunities, a system that seemed totally rigged against them. It makes you wonder if those conditions maybe played a role in what happened next.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And then cocaine enters the picture, and suddenly everything changes. It's almost like this, Faustian bargain for the city. Cocaine brings in a flood of wealth, but it also fuels a ton of violence and corruption that's really hard to even comprehend.
The thesis calls it a paradox, right?
Wow.
Cocaine offered a chance at upward mobility for those who'd been shut out, but at a horrible cost. It disrupted those existing power dynamics by creating this new, dangerous path to wealth and power, one that definitely didn't follow the traditional rules.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where Pablo Escobar enters the picture. He embodies this chaotic rise,
Hmm.
starting small, involved in petty crime. He gradually builds his empire, taking out rivals and establishing a system that's built on fierce loyalty and brutal punishment.
His story is almost unbelievable. He starts dealing marijuana, then moves on to cocaine, and eventually becomes the head of the Medellin cartel, controlling this huge portion of the cocaine flowing into the U.S. It's easy to see how his life has become this subject of so much fascination even today.
One of the most intriguing things about Escobar is this public image he cultivated as a Robin Hood figure, right? He funded housing projects for the poor, he donated to charities, presented himself as a man of the people. But this carefully constructed image was so different from all the violence that he was responsible for.
That's what the thesis calls out, this duality, right? This Robin Hood versus this ruthless criminal persona. It's a key part of his lasting legacy and the reason why people remember him in such different ways. It's like he was two people at once, which makes it even harder to grasp the full reality of who he was and what he did.
Exactly. And his actions really speak for themselves. He was willing to go to any lengths to protect his empire and eliminate anyone he saw as a threat, like the assassination of Rodrigo Larabonilla, the justice minister. He bravely spoke out against Escobar, and Escobar had him killed. It's a really chilling example how far he was willing to go.
It's just hard to imagine the amount of fear and intimidation that he created. And it wasn't just individuals either. He and other powerful traffickers formed this group called Los Extraditables, united in their fight against extradition to the United States. They basically waged war on the Colombian state using these tactics that terrified the whole country.
Yeah, you're talking about bombings, assassinations, kidnappings. They targeted anyone they thought was an enemy. Politicians, journalists, even civilians. And the 1989 bombing of Avianca Flight 203 is a stark reminder of this. It killed over 100 people. And the fact that 2 Americans were among the victims, that really put the cartel on the radar of the U.S. government.
It makes you wonder how someone like Escobar could operate with so much impunity for so long. The thesis points to just widespread corruption within Colombian institutions as a major contributing factor. It seemed like he had influence everywhere. Officials, judges, even the police.
Yeah, it was this systemic problem that let him manipulate the system. In 1991, Escobar actually negotiated his surrender and went to prison, but it was this prison called La Catedral, a prison he designed himself. It sounds more like a luxury resort than a prison, to be honest.
Oh, yeah, it had everything. A soccer field, a jacuzzi, a bar. He even got to choose his own guards. La Catedral became the symbol of Escobar's power and the deep corruption that had infected the Colombian government.
It's crazy, right? And from La Catedral, Escobar continued running his empire. Through lavish parties, even ordered murders. It was a total mockery of justice. But Eventually the facade crumbled when the government decided to transfer him to a more secure facility.
That's when things got really interesting. Escobar escaped in 1992, and it led to a massive manhunt involving Colombian authorities, and they had assistance from the United States. But the thesis points out that the narrative around the U.S. involvement is sort of a gray area.
There are all these conflicting accounts about their role in Escobar's downfall. Some say the U.S. was key, providing intelligence and resources that were crucial to the operation. Others, like journalist Germán Castro Caicedo, they argue that the U.S. contribution was really small, and they were mainly interested in taking credit for Escobar's demise. It brings up these interesting questions about international intervention and who gets to control the narrative.
That debate about the U.S. role is something we could explore further. But for now, let's focus on the last chapter of Escobar's story. The manhunt ended with his death in 1993. He was gunned down on a Medellin rooftop. And that image of his body, it became the symbol of the end of a really dark and turbulent era for Colombia. It's crazy to think that even after his death, Escobar's memory is still this kind of battleground. The thesis really digs into how Colombian society struggles with his legacy and how all those different narratives shape their understanding of the past. It's like even though he's gone, the effects of his actions are still being felt today.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And, the thesis brings up this really interesting concept to help us understand this. Screen memory. It's a term that scholars like Gabriel Schwab use to explain how we often simplify complex and traumatic events, kind of like creating a mental shield to protect ourselves from the full impact of what happened.
So it's not that people are intentionally forgetting things. It's more like their minds are creating a more, manageable version of the past.
Exactly. And with screen memories, we end up with this clear-cut narrative of victims and villains, which can be kind of comforting in a way. But the issue is that this simplification can cover up the deeper societal issues that contributed to these events in the first place.
That makes me think about history textbooks, the ones we had in school. They gave us these nice, neat versions of events, but they often left out the messy realities and the perspectives of those who weren't in power.
That's a great comparison. And in the case of Colombia, if we just focus on Escobar as the ultimate evil, we risk missing the long-standing problems like poverty, inequality, and institutional corruption. These were all there long before Escobar, and they continue to exist today. It's like blaming a symptom without addressing the root cause of the illness, you know what I mean?
This is really the heart of the thesis, isn't it? It's not just about remembering Escobar, it's about understanding all the factors that allowed someone like him to become so powerful.
Right. And the thesis talks about how those different narratives play out in Colombian society. On one hand, you have this emblematic villain narrative, which paints Escobar as the epitome of evil. This is the story that's often pushed by the government, media outlets like El Colombiano, and people who want to distance today's Colombia from its violent past.
Yeah, I can understand wanting to move on from such a traumatic time, but is there danger in simplifying things too much?
For sure. And that's where the folk hero narrative comes in. In some of the poorer neighborhoods in Medellin, Escobar is still seen as this kind of Robin Hood figure because he was generous and challenged the elite.
It's interesting, we have these two completely opposite views of the same person. Do you think both narratives are maybe missing something?
I think that's the main takeaway here. Both narratives give a really simplified version of what happened. They often ignore other important people and the bigger social and political context. They each serve a purpose, but they don't really capture the full complexity of his story.
We should also remember that the people who lived through that time have their own memories and experiences that might not fit neatly into either of these narratives.
Right. Memory is a very personal thing. The thesis looks at how things like class and gender also influence these competing narratives.
Yeah.
For example, Escobar's lower class background is often used to emphasize his brutality. He's seen as this ruthless upstart who got ahead through violence.
The thesis contrasts this with the portrayal of the Cali cartel, especially the Rodriguez Orjuela brothers. They were just as powerful and ruthless as Escobar, but they came from a wealthy background, so they're often seen as more sophisticated, almost like gentlemen of the drugs.
Yeah, it shows how strong class biases are and how they shape our perceptions even when it comes to criminals. And it's not just class, gender plays a role too. People who criticize Escobar often bring up his womanizing to highlight his bad character.
So they're using his personal life as kind of ammunition in this debate over his legacy.
Exactly. And his family is presented in these conflicting ways too. Sometimes they're portrayed as a source of strength, but then they're also shown as a weakness.
It seems like everyone's trying to force Escobar into a category that fits their own view.
I think you've got it. And recognizing this is crucial if we want to truly understand Escobar and his impact.
Now, I want to talk about the United States and their relationship with Colombia during this time. The U.S. was the main market for Escobar's cocaine, which made him rich and powerful. But they were also pushing for a military response to the drug trade, a response that often had terrible effects on Colombians.
That's the hypocrisy the thesis points out. The U.S. was very focused on stopping the drug supply, but didn't really address the demand back home. And this caused a lot of resentment in Colombia towards the U.S. Many people felt that the U.S. was making money from the drug trade while also supporting solutions that actually made things worse.
The thesis also highlights how the idea of corruption is used by different sides to either justify or condemn Escobar's actions.
Escobar's brother, Roberto, argued that corruption was so common that Pablo was just a product of the environment. He's basically saying it was almost guaranteed that someone would take advantage of how corrupt the system already was.
So they're saying Escobar was just a symptom of a much larger problem.
Right. But others say this lets the people in power off the hook too easily. They criticize the government for not addressing the root causes of corruption, which allowed people like Escobar to succeed.
So is Escobar the cause of corruption, or was he a result of it?
It's a hard question, and there's no easy answer. But it highlights the need to move beyond those simple explanations and look at the big picture.
It seems like this complexity also applies to how we remember him. It's clear that understanding Escobar's story requires looking beyond good versus evil. It's a way for us to examine deeper issues like class, gender, corruption, and how memory works.
It's a fascinating and disturbing example of how individuals, societies, and even nations deal with trauma and try to understand the past.
It definitely raises a lot of questions that make you think. We're going to have to pause here for a moment, but when we come back, we'll talk about some of the bigger implications of this thesis and how Escobar's memory continues to influence Colombia and the world today. We've been talking about Escobar's legacy and how memory can be, well, manipulated. What really stood out to me in this thesis is this idea that memory isn't just about the facts. It's more about the feelings we attach to those facts, the stories we build, and how those stories influence how we see the world today.
That's a really good point. And when it comes to Escobar, those narratives are constantly being, challenged and reinterpreted by different groups, often with their own agendas. In fact, the thesis argues that the memory of Escobar has almost become like a cultural currency in Colombia. It's a way for people to define their own identity in relation to the country's past.
So it's not just about remembering what happened, it's using those memories to understand who they are today.
Exactly. You see, for some Colombians, remembering Escobar as this villain helps them distance themselves from that pain, gives them a sense of, I don't know, maybe moral superiority. It's a way of saying, we've learned from our mistakes, we're not like that anymore.
But then for others, especially those who, benefited from his charity or saw him as someone who stood up to a corrupt system, remembering him as a folk hero gives them a sense of power. It's their way of saying, we weren't just victims, we had our own heroes.
Right, and it's fascinating how these completely different stories exist at the same time. It's almost like a fight over who owns the past, whose story matters most, whose voices get heard, who gets to decide how we remember things.
Makes me think about how history is often written by the winners, right? The people who were marginalized or silenced, their perspectives often get lost.
That's so true. And it makes you wonder how these different views on Escobar are shaping Colombian society now. Because it's not just a historical debate, it's a conversation that still has very real consequences today.
Absolutely. And the thesis also explores how Escobar's legacy has become tied to Medellin's image. The city has done amazing work to move away from its reputation as the drug capital. They've invested in education and innovation and created this vibrant atmosphere. But Escobar's shadow is still there. People are still drawn to the city's violent past, whether they're fascinated by it or repulsed by it.
Yeah, it's this difficult balance. How do you acknowledge the past but not be defined by it?
Yeah.
Medellin is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it's also a place that's still healing. And Escobar's memory is this constant reminder of both how fragile peace is and the challenges that Colombia still faces.
We've talked about memory and the impact of the past, but I keep thinking about how Escobar's story has become this commodity. There are tours, TV shows, books, merchandise. It's almost like this morbid tourist attraction.
It is kind of interesting, isn't it? We're both repulsed and drawn to these stories of violence. But the question we should be asking is, how does all this affect how Colombians deal with their past? Does it help with healing and understanding? Or does it exploit their pain?
It's a really difficult question. I don't think there's an easy answer. It's this back and forth between remembering and exploiting, teaching and sensationalizing.
You bring up a good point. When we only focus on the spectacle of Escobar's life, do we miss those deeper issues? Are we just reinforcing harmful stereotypes about Colombia and its people?
It's easy to get caught up in the drama of these stories, but it's important to remember that these are real people, real communities. The consequences go way beyond what we see on TV.
Right. You need to think about how we consume these stories and how they might affect people. It's not just about being entertained, it's about understanding, having empathy, and recognizing our shared humanity.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key things you want our listeners to take away?
One thing I think is really important is recognizing that memory isn't some fixed objective thing. It's always changing. And it's shaped by individual experiences, social norms, even political agendas. What we choose to remember says as much about us now as it does about the past.
It's a reminder that history isn't set in stone, it's a conversation that's still happening.
Exactly. And we all play a part in shaping that conversation. By being critical thinkers, by questioning what we think we know, by listening to different viewpoints, and by understanding our own biases, we can make sure the stories we tell about the past are as accurate and nuanced as possible.
It's about understanding that things aren't always black and white, recognizing that even the toughest stories deserve to be told with care and respect.
And ultimately, it's about using what we know about the past to make a better future.
Well, thank you for joining us on this journey. It's been a fascinating look at a complex topic. We hope it's inspired you to learn more about Colombian history and the legacy of Pablo Escobar.